We're good.
Very good.
Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here. I'm here with Alan Nichol, co-founder and CTO of Rasa. I'm an independent
Hi, everyone.
data and AI scientist who has been working with Alan on a bunch of super fun stuff that we're excited to chat with you about today. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, that would be amazing. And let us know where you're calling in from. And yep, great. We are streaming. I just wanted to make sure that was happening. Alan, maybe you could say a few words about what you do and what Raza does as well.
For sure. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining this morning. And yeah, as Hugo says, drop in the chat and say hello and give us a wave. So I'm Alan. I'm one of the co-founders of Rasa. We built a framework for developing conversational AI. So been around for a minute. Started with our first open source project in 2016. So been thinking about this project with this problem for quite a while. But like, how do you build, better chatbots and voice bots and conversational AI? And obviously very excited about all the developments in the last couple of years. Things have come in leaps and bounds. And through that, we've invented some very cool new things at Rasa, and that's sort of, one of the things we'll be focusing on today.
Awesome. Thanks for that context, Alan. And I've known Alan and the team at Raza for the best part of a decade. We've taught courses on conversational AI for years, and I've been super interested in everything they're doing with conversational AI pre the advent of LLMs. And I've had a lot of challenges putting LLMs in production and helping people put LLMs in production due to a lot of issues. So for obvious reasons, I turned to my people who have been doing this for years to see how they've been integrating LLMs into business workflows. So that's something I'm really excited to kind of code along with you all today and talk about. So without further ado, so this is going to be a live coding session where you get to code along. What I'll do actually first up is put the GitHub repository in the chat. Please go to that repository. Give it a star if you like this stuff, and share it with friends if you think it could be impactful for them. That's how how we raise awareness about these things when we like it. So please do. But if you don't like it, just don't tell anyone. Just go and do something else completely. I will share my screen before diving in to coding. I do want to just say a few things. So, Alan, would you mind confirming that you can see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
So I just wanted to show these beautiful faces with these wonderful logos. I don't want you to add it to your calendar now because if you're here, you already have, but we've just introduced ourselves. And something we did recently, and I'll provide a link to this blog post in a minute. We wrote a technical blog post around how to cut AI assistant costs by up to nearly 80%. And the idea is enhancing LLMs as opposed to just throwing prompts at them using some sort of predefined business logic, which it's important for costs, it's important for accuracy, and it's actually incredibly important for businesses who want the right thing to happen. So these are the types of things we're going to be diving into today. I did not mean to exit. So as we'll get to, the types of things we'll see when we use a framework like Calm, we'll see how the cost definitely goes down with respect to, we benchmarked it against LangGraph in a tutorial that LangGraph and LangChain produced themselves, number of input tokens, latency, and number of output tokens. And we'll also see that when we force our LLMs to respect business logic, they won't do things like violate the arrow of time when booking. And this isn't to cast any shade on LangGraph from my perspective, to be honest. It's really to identify the weaknesses that exist out there with LLMs and then try to figure out how to put quote unquote guardrails. I'm not using that term quite technically, but put them in boxes in business flows that make sure they do the right thing. If you want to check out this post, you can scan this QR code or go to bit.ly/calm-AI, and I'll put this in the chat later as well. As I mentioned, this doc. So a lot of the time with LLMs, we're throwing pretty serious prompts at them, and even a lot of the time it's very difficult to see what the prompt is. Think of a RAG system, right? Where you're querying a document, for example, or a corpus, and it's constructing a prompt that you may not even have insight into. In order to give to the LLM, and really stuffing a lot in those prompts. And if you look at those prompts, a lot of the time you'll end up seeing all types of contradictions and strange things. That's one of the reasons I'm personally not particularly bullish on, larger context lengths and context windows. Ruining, like, meaning RAG will be no longer relevant for a lot of reasons. But the way that calm, and so I want everyone to keep calm, although putting an exclamation point after it is definitively uncalm, I feel. But it was through my excitement that happened. So instead of throwing prompts at an LLM, what we want to do is really respect business logic and business flow. So Alan, maybe at a high level, you can tell us a bit about what's happening here. And then when we get into coding, we can look in the direct, you'll see that these are a bunch of files, right? And we'll have a look at how this works in the directory structure. But maybe you can tell us a bit what's happening at a high level, Alan, here.
Yeah, for sure. So the big thing about calm is that we separate out like executing your business logic from having a conversation, right? So maybe the simplest way I explain calm to people is that you can write down a really minimal description of what are the steps required to complete a task. And then calm lets end users have an arbitrary conversation around that, or all the different tasks that you can complete for them. And typically when you used to code up a chatbot, you would have to think of all the paths that users could navigate and all the things that they could do. And you don't have to do that. So your business logic is really minimal, right? It's just, okay, the user wants to do, make a reservation or something. I need these 3 bits of information for them. And then I need to check that it's actually available before I confirm. So that level of simplicity. And what we really did when we designed this is we have a long history of building conversational AI, but we said, okay, look at this new category of LLMs can clearly do things that previous models never could. So, if we think about what these models can do and we kind of forget everything we know and we just start from scratch, what's the right set of Legos, what's the right set of primitive pieces you need to build conversational AI? With all our experience of knowing the kinds of things, the kinds of conversations that people want to be able to build. And that's really sort of was the origin of what is now Calm. And so, something I shared recently is that, I take issue with phrases like RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation, because it sounds like, especially the way people talk about RAG, it sounds like you just have an LLM and you're just boosting it with some other stuff. You're just putting add-ons around it. Right. And I don't think that's the right way to think about building, a robust system. Ultimately, you have a piece of software, you have a system that you're building, and LLMs are one part of it, but they're not necessarily like the end all and be all, single piece at the center that you're just like bolting things onto. So what we use, LLMs for in Calm is essentially translating, what users are saying into a kind of machine language. And so what we're doing is we're translating when user says something, what that means in the context of your business logic and how to progress the conversation. So, we'll get into all the benefits that gives you, but it means you have a system you can actually program that works reliably. It's much faster, all those kinds of things. And, ultimately, I think a lot of the time where you're leaving the LLM to kind of guess your business logic, unless the logic is actually going to change for every user and for every interaction, there's not really any benefit to having it be dynamic, right? You just want to sort of write it down and know what it is and be able to inspect it and debug it and change it over time.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that that context. And to be even more specific, I mean, when we first started working together over a decade ago, you were using NLU, natural language understanding, here in this position, right? And that's been one of the big wins for the software you build, in addition to be able to having generative responses. But the point is that you use the LLMs and the generative AI at specific points in the flow of how the software is built, in order to retain reliability, and we'll get to what that really means, and consistency. So it does actually behave like software, right?
Exactly, but while still retaining like the incredible power, the ability to understand language, capturing all the nuance that LLMs can understand,
Yeah.
right? Which in the previous generation of an NLU model, you couldn't, because you just had this like very simplistic way of understanding users, which is you have these intents defined, and you could just pick one of them, right? And we could do a
Absolutely.
lot better than that now.
Yeah, exactly. And just to make this very concrete, and this is what we'll get to, we've been kind of in the abstract talking about putting stuff into flows of business logic. We'll be building a travel assistant today, an assistant which can show you your booked flights, it can change flights, it can book rental cars, it can book hotels, it can book excursions. So these 5 items are the flows that an LLM will figure out which one you want to be put into. And then once a user is in those flows, that the software, the assistant will figure out certain slots to fill, such as what date you want your flights on, what hotel you want to stay at, and that type of stuff. Make sure they're validated, and then give the results, essentially. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Alan?
No, I think you nailed it.
Great. So I do think it's important to quickly put this in the broader context of the space. So actually, why don't we just have a quick look at this slide first? We've talked around this, but I really, before we jump into coding, and we'll start coding in 2 to 3 minutes, everyone, just for those who are getting impatient like myself. But Alan, maybe you can just break down the differences in what you see as to the capabilities of Calm and LLM. More generally, agents. Agents is an overloaded term, but
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And we have this table in our docs, and when we publish this table, like agents meant a very specific thing, and that's not the case anymore. Now it just kind of means chatbot, right? But at the time when we published this, and we should update the exact phrasing here, agents meant very specifically like having an LLM guess your business logic, right? So if you have some of these tasks that we talked about, like booking a flight, changing a flight, rather than you saying, okay, to change a flight, I need, these 5 bits of information, which is the way we would do it with Calm. You just have an LLM, guess those steps, right? And conceptually, when do you want that to be dynamic and kind of guessed on the fly for each user every time, and when might you want that to be static and written down and sort of executed, right? And I think ultimately the way I think about it is if it's genuinely going to be different for every user, like every user needs different logic, they need a different set of steps, then of course it makes sense to make that dynamic and on the fly. Or if the APIs are going to be changing every day that you interact with them, then of course you need to be dynamic as well. Or if you don't really have that kind of structure, right? If it's not that you have a specific flow that you want to guide a user through, that you want to help them change a flight and the information that you need, you just have a set of APIs and you kind of just want to build like a universal assistant that can just interact with those APIs on behalf of a user. Then for all those good reasons, then you would need all of that to be dynamic. And the only way really to do that right now is to have the LLM kind of guess it on the fly. So that's when this sort of like agentic or like React style agent approach really makes sense. And what we found is just for the kinds of things that people use Rasa for, it's just not the case, right? People have some kind of process that they want to automate, whether it's like internal for their employees or external for customer service, and they know what the steps are, right? And so if you know what the steps are and you want them to be followed well and reliably, it's silly to have an LLM guess those steps every time, right? So that's maybe the distinction that table tries to highlight.
absolutely. Really appreciate that. And is there anything, I mean, you spoke to most of these points here, but you want to add on with respect to, maybe I'll just say, when we have the y-axis being effectiveness, like my scientific background is like, what are your units? But of course, that's a joke. When we're talking about effectiveness, we're talking about reliability, cost, performance, and ability to execute outcomes. And we'll see how these all play out when we start coding.
Yeah, I think effectiveness, in a real production system, you can actually measure, right? It's like how many users have a good, experience interacting with your chatbot, right? And I think we've all, built with sort of intent-based or NLU-based things here over on the right. In the past, we kind of hit the limits, right? And that, very often when I talk to teams that are pretty advanced, we look at their system and like, it's not that they don't have a good NLU model. It's just the performance limits that they're hitting are just the fundamental assumption of everything fits into an intent. That's sort of the wall that you hit, right? And that's kind of where the effectiveness caps out. And what we looked at when we looked at this sort of agentic tutorial with LangGraph for the customer service agent, the reason the effectiveness is not really any higher than that is just for the vast majority of conversations, something goes wrong somewhere along the way, right? And that's sort of the cost, right? Because then, we didn't talk about that in the previous table. It's like, okay, well, what's actually the cost of having the LLM just guess the business logic, right? Isn't that
Mm,
faster? Because then I don't have to write it down. Um, even with like GPT-4 and Claude 3.5 type of models, what we see in this is just wildly inconsistent, right? And only very few of the conversations actually like do what they're supposed to do, without any errors.
absolutely.
So that's why it's also much lower on the effectiveness scale.
Fantastic. Well, appreciate that context as well. So what we're going to start coding in a second, but what we're going to need to do, we're going to need to get two keys. So we're going to do it with OpenAI today, so leveraging their API. So what you're going to need to do is to go to this link, which is platform.openai.com/API keys, and I'm going to post that in the chat as well. And please do continue. I can see, we've got over 25 people here. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from, what you do, where you work, if you're involved in this type of work, and what your interest is. So what you'll do is you'll go and create a key, and I always find this confusing where I'm in project keys now and it says project API keys have replaced user API keys, and it tells me to view user API keys, but I'm at, well, anyway, UX issues, and you can click when you create it, you can then copy it. So you're going to create new secret key and test. I'm not going to create it. Okay, I will actually. I'm going to create a test key. Yeah, exactly. The demo gods are not shining. Okay, I've got my key, so I'm not going to do that at the moment. You're going to create a key. And so the other thing is, if you don't have billing set up with OpenAI, you won't be able to do that at the moment, but you'll be able to code along afterwards, and you can look at our CARMS documentation to see how you can use other APIs and LLMs as well, but we'll be using OpenAI today. Now, you'll need one other API key, which you do not need any credit card or anything along those lines for, which is a Rasa Pro license key. And what I'm going to do is paste that. It's in the GitHub repository. Paste that in the chat as well. And what you'll do, it will take you to a page like this where you put in your email address and click that box and submit. And you'll, in the space of 30 seconds, get an email with a license key here. And nobody try to, use some multimodal LLM to try and extract my key from a screenshot or something like that, because I've cut it off at the bottom. So I've tricked you all. No one can get my key there. But go and get your Rasa Pro developer key as well, and then we'll be able to start. What you're going to do then is you're going to open a code space. So actually, what you'll see, I've already got one open, but I'm going to create a new one so we can do it from the start. What you'll see is create code space on main. When you click this code, I'm going to create a new one, create code space on main. And this should take 1 to 2 minutes it will set up a GitHub Codespace, which if you've used VS Code, looks like a web-based VS Code, because it essentially is. That will take a minute or two. Now, while that's loading, I'll just show you. I've actually spun up another one before this session, so that before we write any code, we can just look at the assistant that we'll be playing with. And you'll recall that this assistant can show booked flights, change flight bookings, book a rental car, book a hotel, and book an excursion. So let's just chat with it for a bit, Alan, while the code space is spinning up. Maybe you can tell me what we should say to it. What do you want to say to this travel assistant?
Oh, there you go. Well, what do we say we could do? It could show your flights, and it could change your flights. So
let's even just ask it,
with
what can you do? So to make sure, okay, yep. So list flight bookings, change them, book rental cars, hotels, and excursions.
Cool. Let's take a look at our flight bookings.
Look at flights, and I've done several typos there, so we'll see. Great. So I have an upcoming flight from Charles de Gaulle in Paris to Basel on the 30th of April. So just to be clear, and we've made this clear in the blog post and in the repository, this is a project where the date is actually set to be the end of April. So also it's strange that I'm traveling in Europe and it's an American date style, but I'm not a fan of the American date styles. So anyway, what do you want to do now, Alan? Should we change our flights or what do you
Let's do that. Yeah. Let's look at alternatives.
change them? When would I, and wow, okay, so it's asked me when I'd like to fly. And this is the developer environment. This is not what an end user sees. This is once you build an assistant, what you can see as a developer. So, Alan, maybe you can talk us through a bit of what's happening here. A lot of stuff has popped up, right?
Definitely. So what we show here in the middle panel for the developer view is the business logic that is currently active that you're in, and where you are in that process, right? And so kind of as we said, like the business logic in a comm assistant doesn't describe here are all the things that the user could say, and what if they do this and what if they do that? We just say, look, if we want to change a flight, right, we need a few things, right? And so these are the purple boxes here. We need the start date, the end date of like the search range. We're going to then have a step where we search for some flights. We're going to ask, which is the one that they want to pick, and then ask for a final confirmation. So this is just, moments where we have to collect some information. And what this represents is how that data needs to be collected from the user and from any APIs before you can proceed. What it doesn't say is like, here are the exact conversations that people can have, right? So if we want to interject here, ask a side question, ask about some other business logic, change our mind about something we said earlier, all those kinds of things, it's flexible enough to handle all of those cases. But, for a developer, you can still sit here and see, okay, well, we're exactly here. These slots have been filled. We've gone this far in the logic, and, this is where the branching is going to happen depending on, what the user said next.
So I'm going to try to jump out of this then. You've just told me that I can, try to get into another part of the business logic. So I'm actually saying, actually keep the flights the same. Can I get a hotel?
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. And look at this. It's now taken me to a different flow and told me, I got it. I'll keep your flights the same. I want to check in on the day that my flight arrives. When do I want to leave? Stay for 1 week. So we can see.
What I'd call out here as well is that the little orange highlighted cell is like, this is where you are, right? So now we're currently asking, we've suggested some hotels, and now we're asking which one of these is suitable for you.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna, look, the Hilton looks pretty good, and I don't even know who's paying for this trip. So let's go. Yes. And it's uttered a confirmation. Okay, you booked it for me. Now no flow is currently active. So look, that was a kind of a teaser of what the assistant looks like. You can play around with it for get into different flows, but I haven't shown you how to build it yet, right? In the code space. So now I really want to jump in and check out what's happening here, right? So as I said, we're in something which resembles VS Code. And so we have our local file system on the left. We can have our scripts, notebooks, whatever files rendered in the middle. And we have our terminal here. It's really nice how it opens the README straight away. So let's just read the README because I wrote the README, but I often make mistakes when trying to do this without reading it. So, okay. So create 2 terminals. You can create another terminal down here. And so we'll need 2 because we want to start something called the Rasa action server, which allows the assistant to do a whole bunch of skills. And we want to run that as a server in one terminal, right? So now I just want to create or load our environment, which will have all the packages we need. So we have source.vn/bin/activate. And we're going to do that in the other one as well. Now comes something tricky. I'm going to open, so it says open the env calm LLM.env to add the required keys to that file. Now, the reason this is tricky is because I'm going to add my keys. What you want to do is add the keys after this, and then we'll be able to get them into the environment as environment variables, essentially. I don't want anyone to see my keys. So I'm just going to sneak over here very briefly to my other screen and paste my keys in, and then come back. I'm trying to talk and keep the ball rolling while doing that. And I'm thinking
It's pretty impressive how you're doing all this.
I think I'm doing a relatively good job, but we'll see how it goes. And you'll see I have. So hopefully that end, I mean, the proof will be in the pudding, as we say. Now, to set those environment variables, I'll source the file name. So you need to paste those keys in as well, of course, not my keys because you haven't seen them. .env, and do the same in the other. And we're nearly there. There are a couple more things we need to do. One is to create a little database, which will be able to read where our hotel bookings are and that type of stuff from. So we're going to do Python scripts, create db.py. And while that's happening, we'll jump across to the other terminal, and we're going to train our model. So while that's happening, Alan, maybe you can just say a bit about what training this type of model actually means, because it isn't quite how we think about like fit and predict in the scikit-learn or the machine learning paradigm, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess you could call it like a build step or a compile step or something like that. It also depends on which components of Rasa you're using. And so, these days, if you're building, a brand new Rasa assistant with Calm, you're probably using LLMs for a lot of the, understanding and a lot of the ML components. And that doesn't actually require any training because,
I'm just going to
the
stop
way it
you
makes
for one
predictions is just,
second. I'm so
yeah.
sorry. I did not read my own instructions, and I didn't actually CD into the correct. So this is, lesson. CD Calm LLM, and then do Rasa train. So I'm sorry, but I needed to correct that live. So yeah, go on, Alan.
Cool. Well, that gives me a chance to give a shorter answer as well, which is that, in previous versions of Rasa, when you run Rasa train, it always involved training a model, right? An NLU model, maybe a dialog policy, those kinds of things. These days, if you're building a Calm assistant and you're only using LLMs for everything, Rasa train is just like a compile step. It just kind of builds everything together. We obviously kept the name, but you can still use NLU models sort of, as part of your Calm assistant if you want to. It's a nice performance optimization. And so if you use those, then when you run Rasa train, you do still actually train some models under the hood. But it's more like a project build step or a compile step or something like that.
Awesome. Appreciate that context. And now what I've also done, in the other terminal, I've CD'd into the same Calm LLM folder. And I've done Rasa run actions. I'm not going to open this application in the browser. It's the other one I'll open when I inspect it. Alan, can you tell us a bit about what running actions actually is and why I'm not opening it in the browser?
Yeah, actions are, I guess they're kind of like Lambda functions, or, how else might you call them? Fulfillment. Some platforms call them fulfillment, right? So they're the bits of code that interact with your actual APIs. So if you have a backend where you store your users, or, where you actually do bookings, or, fetch information, all of that kind of stuff, your action server is just a collection of like little Lambda functions, little atomic functions that just go and do that on behalf of the user. And so typically that's run as a separate server. However, with Rasa 3.10, which was just released yesterday, you can actually run the actions as part of your main Rasa server. So you no longer have to start a separate server. Provided that you wrote your custom actions in Python, they can all be run just as part of one process.
Great. And the reason I'm not opening this in a browser is because there's nothing to open, essentially, right?
Yeah, it's headless. There's nothing there. It's just an API that your assistant uses.
Fantastic. And so I've Rasa run actions in one, Rasa train in the other, and now I can Rasa inspect to launch the inspector we saw before. I'm going to put in debug mode just because that gives me a bit more output in the terminal if I need to debug. But we'll see the code space cleverly will offer to, once it's ready, to open in browser. And we'll see the jubilant couscous. I mean, Codespace names things hilariously. Inspector appear immediately. So I'm going to say, "What's up?" to the assistant. I don't know. How can you help me? So I do. What can you do? Okay, great. Let's just play around with it like we did before. List flights. I'm going to Basel, where I don't know about public transport in Basel, man. So I'm going to need a car. I actually have no idea about public transport in Basel. So 4:30.
I think Basel's pretty walkable, no?
Well, maybe I don't need a car. Maybe I'll just get the car for 1 day then, or 2 days. Oh, wait. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. Okay. So May. That's embarrassing. It's like
You're
right and left.
thinking out loud to a new level. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
great. Yeah.
I mean, I'm 6'4", so I'm thinking they don't have like a Citroen DS or something like that. That's the one that saved Charles de Gaulle's life in an assassination attempt. I don't know if you know that. He put down this car and its armor essentially to saving his life. So
That's a good bit of trivia.
it
Yeah.
really is. So I want no, I'm just gonna go because I want a big car for me, but I'm driving in Europe, so I kind of want a small car for Europe. Alamo. Let's go with that. I always joke, you know, how like smart cars in Europe, right? How like if you
Mhm.
if you had them driving in highways in the US, you'd have to call them dumb cars because they'd get blown away by just being in America,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
by the wind draft of a big truck.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, I've booked a car. And look, I want an excursion as well. Can't spell. I want to go to the zoo. Yes. So note that
Yeah, you got
what
busy
just happened,
itineraries
man.
there, Hugo.
Exactly. That's really important. Okay. So the fact that we hadn't programmed this assistant to ask for slot validation around a particular date, and maybe that's something you actually want to do. Unless Basel Zoo, you can buy a ticket and use it any day. But these are the types of things that you need to think about more in terms of actually performing conversation design as well, which everyone should do when building assistants, right?
100%. Yeah.
We have a question from Ahmet. I don't know if you can see it, Alan, in the chat. How can we dynamically define a slot in an intent? For example, how do I list all the products crazy in the database? That may be a typo, not sure, in an intent where I expect the user to enter a product name for product selection.
Yeah, it's a good question. So you have like a large list of products, and probably there's some sort of internal jargon for your company, right? They're not like product names that anybody would use. They maybe have like codes attached to them or that kind of thing. So a couple ways you can do it. I mean, the simplest way probably is to have a lookup table, right? And what you can do in COM is even if you're using COM and you're building a fully sort of LLM native assistant, you can still integrate, an entity extraction component just to do normal sort of entity extraction and use those to fill a slot. So to do that, then you would have a component that just uses a lookup table as like a simple way of doing it. Depending on how many products you have, right? If it's really a huge database, you could also pull the relevant product names in to the context and do kind of an in-context thing. So use it as part of the prompt for the LLM. But honestly, I would say if you have like a fixed list of product names that you know, then I would just use a lookup table component and just use that as an entity extractor and use that to fill the slot.
Great.
There's a couple of code steps that I'm waving my hand over here. So unless you're pretty knowledgeable about Rasa, you probably can't follow those instructions that I gave. Um, if you want more concrete sort of actual code of how to do what I just said, please post on the forum. So forum.rasa.com. Feel free to tag me as well on there. And we'll provide some more concrete examples of how you can do what you just said.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And keep an eye out on the forum. We had some really great office hours for Rasa and Calm last week. So keep an eye out on the forum for the next announcement for the next office hours, which should be in several weeks as well. So we've got just under 25 minutes left. I just want to give a breakdown of what we're going to do. Before jumping into the code of how to build these assistants, I do want to talk about evaluations for a second. So I'm running a script currently called eval.py, which runs evaluations. We'll see what it looks like in a second. But where are we? We have these end-to-end tests. So we want to test a variety of situations that can arise. So we have the happy paths where user books a car, and you can see, I'd like to book a car in which city, to Basel, etc., and so on. User books an excursion, user books hotel, user list flights. Then we have slightly different ones where user changes mind about price range, right? User switches from car to hotel. So you will have noticed I did something like that successfully. Then we have multi-skill ones where user changes flight, book hotel, car, and excursion. So what you'll see here is, the assistant we have running, that we're running the action server for currently is running, and we're generating conversations with it and running end-to-end tests. And we're seeing, so in the happy part, in multi-skill, there were 5 different tests. In the happy parts, there were 5. All of those have passed. Thank goodness. That'd be embarrassing if they didn't. And then we're just looking at cost, completion tokens, prompt tokens per user message, latency, and these types of things. But Alan, because we know we work in a space where evaluation is one of the most important things, maybe you can tell us a bit about how you've approached end-to-end testing at Rasa with Calm.
No, for sure. And I think this is also kind of an example of maybe the table that we showed before of the different approaches, right? If you genuinely have a need for, every single time a user interacts with the chatbot, the logic needs to be a little bit different, then it's also a difficult system to evaluate, right? Because it's very difficult to say, did the chatbot behave as it should have, or did it do something weird, or was it a good experience or not? And it becomes a kind of fuzzy problem of like judging the quality of a conversation. Again, if you have cases, which I think a lot of chatbot use cases fall into, where you have some specific logic that you want to follow, it also becomes very straightforward to evaluate your assistant because, it's either doing the right thing or it's doing the wrong thing, right? It's either understanding the user and fulfilling the requests or it's not. And so the first level of evals that we do at Rasa is, just run through a bunch of like example conversations and just check that, everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. And you can use that kind of like, the way you use unit tests or integration tests when you're building software, to check against regressions, right? So that somebody adds, a new skill to your bot or changes some logic or makes it more complicated. You want to make sure that you're not breaking anything when you do that, right? And, if you're just throwing a bunch of information into a prompt, these things can get very fragile and it can be hard to debug. So it's nice to have these kind of isolated components and a rigorous sort of suite of tests.
Appreciate that, Alan. And so as you'll see, all the tests passed here. We have these outputs where we were computing latency and those types of metrics of interest. As I showed you at the start, we have some pretty significant results with respect to how much we can save cost and latency and that type of stuff. I do want to let you know how you can reproduce those results. And then we're going to jump into just having a look at how we think about building these assistants in terms of the Python code, essentially. So you can see in the README what I've just talked about with respect to quantitative evaluation. All of that's there. You can run the end-to-end test as such. You can also pipe the results to a text file, of course. What I did in the end, so to be clear, you'll notice that until now, we've been in the Calm LLM directory. subdirectory. That's the assistant we're building. There's also the LangGraph implementation, which is from their tutorial. And then there's a Calm NLU one, which we'll say a bit about in a minute, which is like Calm LLM, but slightly optimized. Right? So to get the LangGraph assistant, this is what you need to do, and you can run the evaluations there as well. Now, these are instructions for how to create the figures from files that are there, or create all the data in terms of running the tests and extracting the latencies and that type of stuff. We've got all that there, so all you need to do is open the notebook, but you can run all of this if you want to confirm it yourself. To have a look at the notebook, what I'm going to do is, so I open the notebook now. A bit of trickery here. You'll need to select a kernel, and you'll need to install Jupyter and enable IPython here. So that will happen in a couple of seconds. While that's loading, Alan, can you tell us a bit about what the Calm NLU, because we just said, wait, like one of the great things is we don't need NLU anymore, right? But that's not quite right. But wait, there's more.
Yeah, for sure. So I believe for many years that a big bottleneck in the performance of chatbots is this concept that, intents rule everything. And the job of understanding users is just to like pick the right intent. And that is a big limitation. It's a big bottleneck. And I'm very excited that, Calm gets rid of that. But, intents aren't totally dumb, and they exist for a reason, and they've served us very well for many years for a reason, right? So when somebody says something very straightforward, like, I'd like to change my flight, or I want to book a hotel, or something like that, those things are very well captured by an intent, and like an NLU model can predict that very, very well, right? So long as you're not saying that every message has to fit into an intent, you can still use an NLU model and do that classification. And so that's a nice optimization in a Calm assistant, because it means that, for whatever fraction of user messages, whether it's a quarter or half or 3/4 or whatever, that do fit nicely into an intent, you don't have to call an LLM at all, right? And that's obviously, it's faster, it's cheaper, it's nice. And a lot of people have, especially in bigger projects, they have NLU models that they've developed that perform really nicely and perform pretty well. So why would you just throw that away, right?
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Alan. And so, as you'll see, we've got everything installed. Click select kernel again if necessary to get up this select kernel vibe. Click Python environments, and we want our .vn, which is the one that we installed earlier. Now, I'm going to clear all outputs and do the dastardly run all button in a notebook, and we'll, this is real YOLO, right? At least I didn't call the notebook untitled, like 0036 or whatever. So this is essentially code that takes all the data that we've created and munged there in order to create these figures where we can actually see the comparisons across different cases between the Calm bot and the LangGraph bot, right? So the happy paths we see there, and we can see the performance here. And I'm not going to go through in detail what all of this says, but you can read our blog post. But you can see we do have significant reductions across all key metrics: multi-skill, cancellations, context switch. Then you can see the next figures we've shown actually have the Calm NLU bot as well. And for those, I'm sorry, I should explain. I just assumed everyone here is a bit scientific, but you all well, not even that. Even scientific people may not have seen box and whisker plots before. We have all the costs here as dots in a little B-swarm plot. And then we have box and whisker plots where this middle bar is the median. Then this is the 75th percentile, which is the median of all the data above the median. And similarly, this is the 25th percentile, which is the median of all the data below the median. And because we get lots of results that are very close to zero, we have it looking a bit funny there. But that all makes sense. And then you'll see at the very bottom, we've plotted a table of the mean across Calm, LangGraph, and NLU. And then the median. Sorry, these have moved over slightly. Okay. So you'll see for completion tokens, or let's look at costs. The Calm mean is 0.04, whereas the LangGraph mean is 10 cents. So feel free to, I've linked to the blog post again. please feel free to go through. We'd love to know your thoughts. We're even more excited about you getting up and running with building these types of assistants. So we have, 10 minutes left, or so, just a bit more. Alan, I am interested how you would like to go through the file structure, or what's happening there. So perhaps you could prompt me as a function of this diagram to help us understand what's happening in the directory in order to build this assistant.
Yeah, for sure. So the flow files are the ones that contain your business logic. And so maybe if we start with the list flights one, I think that one's probably the
Great.
simplest one, the list
So
flight bookings.
yes, everyone, if you're in Calm LLM, you'll see that we have this data flows directory. So we're going to jump in there, and you'll see that we have flows essentially for each skill. Is that a good way to put it, Alan? And then a few other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So list
Yeah.
flight bookings. Great.
Cool. So this is a very simple, minimal bit of business logic. And what this says is, okay, if the user asks to list their flights, go and check the database and see what flights we have. If they have some, tell them, which ones they have. And if not, then tell them that there aren't any, right? So, very straightforward, little bit of business logic, but it shows some of the kind of key elements. And so the key parts of a flow are you have a description and you have a list of steps. And the description helps, Rasa understand like when is this flow relevant? When should we what kinds of things does it do for the user? Right. And it's maybe like the kind of closest thing to like an intent in a pure COM assistant, right? Where you're not using it on a given model. You're saying, here's the kinds of things that users would be asking for that would lead us into this flow. And then the steps, there are kind of two kinds of steps primarily. So there's a step where you take an action. So you're just doing something. You're either telling the user something or you're calling an API. And then there are collect steps. And in a collect step, you're asking the user for some information, right? So this is a very simple flow. So we don't actually have any collect steps. We don't actually have to ask the user for anything. We just have to go and call an API. So we have an action step here. The first step, this is a YAML list. So we say list flight bookings. So what that does is it's going to call one of your custom actions, one of your Lambda functions, and say, what flight bookings does this user have? Right. So let's maybe go and take a look at the implementation of that.
Great. So would I go into actions then?
Yeah. So let's go into actions and then list flight bookings. Cool. So here's the place where you would write code to interact with your APIs, right? So in this case, actually most of this code is just like formatting the results in a nice way so that it's sort of easily readable and the dates are nice. But ultimately what this does is it's calling out to your database and saying, okay, what flights has this user booked, right? And then the way that these actions communicate with your bot is primarily through slots. So slots are just variables. So they're like a key value store that you use, for each conversation. It's a set of variables that you track to keep track of how the conversation is progressing and what's happening. And so, within one of these actions, you can access the value of slots that have already been set. So like, I don't know, the user ID, any other things that you need to know about the user, things that they've requested, preferences, information that they've provided. And then you can go and call out and fetch new information. And you can return that back to the conversation to use in your logic of your flow. So in this case, the exact values of the slots that the exact values of the bookings that you found, you go and like return those to the conversation by setting slots. They're kind of like the return values of the function.
Awesome. So what I'm also interested in is, so when we had utter list flight bookings and utter no flight bookings, where have we defined them?
Yeah, that's a really good next question. And so those are defined in the domain file, right? And so let's take a look in the corresponding domain file. So you can define a template for each of these responses, right? And you can reuse the same response in as many different flows as you want, right? Like if you just have, regular confirmation messages and all those kinds of things, these are sort of atomic and reusable components you can use everywhere. So you can use these as a simple template. So if you look here, for example, the second response after those flight bookings, it contains curly brackets and there's a variable in there, which is actually just the name of a slot. So you can use
Yeah.
slot values in these templates. And so the way we think about Calm is that depending on how much freedom you want, you can kind of adjust the dial of how much you want the LLM to do for you, right? So you can rely entirely, if you want, on these like scripted, templated responses. And you can say, and that's sort of what we started off with today, is like building a travel assistant that never hallucinates, right? So if you're only using these scripted responses, you can guarantee that your bot will never hallucinate because you're never sending any generated text to the user. One nice thing you can do that kind of enhances the UX a little bit is you can start with these templates, but then you can allow the LLM to kind of rephrase them, right? And so there's a little component and there's a little prompt in there just to say, hey, can you, just rephrase it slightly to make it sound a bit more natural to kind of fit the conversation a little bit more. And that, you're already providing the answer that you want to give, and you're just allowing the LLM a little bit of freedom to rephrase it. So it's like if you want to take on a little bit more risk, and improve the UX a little bit. I mean, of course, it also incurs some extra cost. It also incurs some extra latency because you are doing an LLM call. Although, you don't need a super fancy GPT-4 level LLM to do that task. And then finally, if you really want to, you can have just like free form responses as well, where you just say, okay, here's where we're at in the conversation. Let the LLM decide, how to phrase the response completely de
That
novo.
sounds
So,
dangerous.
yeah, I mean, it is. And that then, of course, opens you up to like prompt injection and, all sorts of potential issues. But it's really, it depends on the use case that you have, whether it's internal or external facing, depending on kind of your risk profile, what industry you're in, all those kinds of things. It might make sense, it might not. And so if you create a new, fresh Calm assistant on the command line, so if you follow the Codespace's quick start there and just create a new project, that one by default will use like a purely generative model just for chit chat. So anytime Rasa says, okay, this is just chit chat, the person's just making small talk, then it will just use a generative component to respond to that. So you don't have to go and like author a bunch of like appropriate responses for various bits of chit chat. Again, you can just switch that off easily if you don't want to, but it's just like a nicer experience when you're first using the bot to say, okay, well, here's a few things. It can already handle some small talk, right?
Great. And I've actually just pasted. I mean, hopefully everyone here is up and running with, this travel assistant. But if you want to try the very basic quick start, I've pasted the link in the chat here as well. Couple minutes left before I want to just tell you what we're up to next. So hopefully you can join our next session. There are a lot of different ways we can go here, Alan. But I suppose you mentioned, and I mentioned this earlier, the use of other models and that type of stuff. So perhaps we can look in the file system to tell people where they can switch in and out, whatever models or APIs they want to use.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to look at a file called config.yaml. So yeah, you found it pretty quickly. And so something that has always been true about Rasa and continues to be true in the sort of Calm paradigm is that we don't believe in like hiding any of the details of what's going on or any of the ML or any of the algorithms or anything like that. Believe in sort of giving users access to change and modify that and make it better for their own use cases, and to pick the models that work for them because there's no sort of one size fits all. And so the place you configure that is in this config YAML file. So if you're using any of the standard sort of supported APIs and models, and there's a long list in the documentation of the different ones we support, which includes like, the APIs that are well known, of course, OpenAI is what we've been using today, but, Anthropic and Hugging Face endpoints and those kinds of things. But also support for like locally running models, right? So if you want to use Olama or things like that, and you have a model that you're running yourself, you can also do so. So you can be sort of completely independent of these APIs. And I mean, well, maybe stay tuned for that, but there's some exciting news coming out in terms of custom models and models you can run yourself. But we'll just tease that for now before that's fully ready for prime time.
Well, that segues wonder. And of course, we've got some very exciting fine-tuning stories to tell you as well. But what I want to do is give a quick plug for a webinar that Alan, myself, and our colleague and friend Daksh, who's a senior product manager and an absolute beast at this type of stuff, we'll be doing in a couple of weeks. We'll be talking. We won't be doing live coding in this session, but we'll be talking more deeply about the types of things we've been discussing today as well. So please do sign up for this. You can scan the QR code or go to bit.ly/Calminar. I contracted Calm webinar into a single word. I hope this is what I become famous for. I want this to be my great last dance in my early 40s. But we'll see how that goes. Keep calm and carry on. We do have a question. Whoever just wrote hello to you too. Oh yeah, really cool question, dude. I think Norbert has asked, do you recommend running different models for different components based on the task, e.g. GPT-4 for command generation, but a more lightweight model for rephrasing?
Yeah, bang on. Exactly what he said is actually the default. So the rephrasing uses 3.5 by default, and 4 for the command generator. So absolutely.
Amazing.
And Pranay's coming in here saying that he's doing exactly the same. So
very cool.
And we're making loads of progress on smaller models being capable of the command generation task as well. And that's sort of part of the fine-tuning story that you were hinting at, Hugo. So
yeah,
I think everyone will be excited when they can start using smaller models and models they control and own and not rely on APIs to do their own thing with the command generation task.
Absolutely. Look, it's time to wrap up. I'd like to thank you all for joining. For those who have tried out building an assistant in real time, congratulations. For those who haven't, please do as soon as you have the chance. Encourage you very much to get your free Rasa Pro license and an OpenAI API key or whatever other types of models you'd like to use. But getting the Rasa Pro license is the most important thing here to then get into the action. Build your assistants. Let us know how you go on the Rasa forum. And can you remind me what the URL for the Rasa forum is, Alan?
I'm just going to drop it in the chat as well.
Great.
It's just forum.rasa.com. If you Google Rasa forum, I'm sure you'll find it.
Yeah, and I'll also put this webinar link in the chat as well. We'd be really excited to see you there. And it seems like everyone has had fascinating questions so far. So please do join for our free webinar or Calminar, if you will. And we're super excited to see you there. Any closing thoughts, Alan?
Just that, something we started last week and we want to keep doing is office hours. So then, if you're struggling with anything or you have questions or how-to questions or just cool product feedback or ideas, things that we should be doing, come hang out. The next one will be, end of September, I think. And we're going to try and do these monthly. So come hang out and, we'd love to see your questions.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you at the webinar in a couple of weeks in the next office hours.
Thanks, Hugo.
And seeing, dude, man, that was cool.
That was good, huh? We got